Hey guys, okay, so this is part 2 of the chapter 4 tutorial on looping. Um, Before we get into talking about for loops, which this is going to be a pretty quick video, but before we talk about for loops, I wanted to touch one more time on while loops, and I wanted to show you a little bit more of a little bit more advanced program um, to show you some of the things that we can do with a while loop that are pretty simple. In this particular program, basically what I'm asking the user to do is enter the month that they were born or that someone was born. Enter a birth month. Now, we can do some data validation with our programming. This ties in to if then else statements that we talked about in chapter 3 as well as while loops. So obviously, when you enter in a birth month, it can be a value from 1 to 12, and it has to be 1 to 12 whole numbers, right? So we can't enter anything less than 1. We can't enter anything greater than 12. So what this program is going to do is it's going to have the user input a birth month, um, and it's going to allow them 3 attempts. If they put in an invalid birth month, um, more than 3 times, it's going to end the program. So they have to enter a valid birth month in order for this to work correctly. So just really quickly, let's go ahead and run the program. And all it does is if you successfully enter a birth month, it just displays the month again. So birth month is 4. You could set this up to say 4 is April and 7 is July, and actually print out the name of the month if you wanted to. But so that's simply what it does. Now let's see what happens when we enter in an invalid birth month. So if I hit 0, it says, oh, invalid, enter birth month. 15, invalid. 18, invalid. 20, 30, invalid. And then it says you are not smart once you use up all 4 attempts. So let's look at this program and see what it's actually doing. So we've set a variable called high month that says, okay, the highest the birth month can be is 12. We have a low month that says the lowest it can be is 1. And then we have the number of attempts they can have, which is 3. It's really 4 because you have your initial input, but then you have 3 attempts after that. So one of the first things we have to do is enter in our control variable, our loop control variable. So we've initialized it, count, to be 0. Now we actually have 2 loop control variables in this particular statement, in this particular program. One is the count, so because we want to count how many attempts they do to make sure they don't go over their number of attempts. And then also the birth month. So they have to enter some sort of birth month and make sure that it's less than or equal to 12 or greater than or equal to 1 in order for this to work correctly. So in our while loop, we have a little bit more of a complex expression to evaluate. So basically what we're saying here is that count has to be less than attempts. So it cannot be more than 3. And the month that is entered has to be less than, it doesn't have to be. This is, in this while loop, we're saying if the month is less than low month, or the month is greater than high month. If all of this is true, then we can go into our loop body here. This loop body is simply, all it's handling is invalid inputs. So if the count is less than the number of attempts, and if the month falls outside of 1 or outside of 12, then we're going to come in here and we're going to increase our count, that's how we're controlling the number of attempts that we have. And then we're also saying invalid number, enter a new birth month, right? So we can loop through this guy 3 times, because once count is greater than 3, then this expression is not going to evaluate to be true, and we're going to exit out of the loop. So one thing to make note of here are using our ands and our ors. So remember that when you have an and, both sides of the and need to be true. So count has to be less than attempts, and these month evaluations have to be the same. If you have an or, either side of these could be true for it to evaluate as true. Remember that from chapter 3. So once we've done this, let's say we enter in a successful birth month, we do some more error checking down here. And so if we've used up the number of attempts, so if count is greater than or equal to 3, and we've entered in an incorrect birth month, then we end up printing out and saying that you are not smart. Else, we print the birth month is this. So as long as we enter a valid birth month, we're going to skip this while loop, and we're going to exit this while loop, and then we're going to go in here into this if-then-else statement and print the birth month. Or we may print you are not smart if we use up the number of attempts. So this is just a quick program. I wanted to show you guys a little bit more advanced where we're using 2 different control variables and doing some interesting things with loops. I can post this on Blackboard. I can post this on the class so that you guys can look at it later on. Okay, so on to for loops. So on a for loops are just another type of loop. Almost all programming languages have them. They're also known as a for next loop. For loops are always going to be definite loops. We talk about indefinite loops when we use while loops, meaning we don't know how many times it's going to loop through. When we have a for loop, we always know how many times it's going to loop through. For loops are actually just a really good way to simplify your loop and make everything happen in one small compact statement. What I mean by that is, with the while loop, we had to initialize the control variable, we had to evaluate the control variable, and we had to alter the control variable. When you do a for loop does all 3 of those things in one statement without you having to do the initialization and so on and so forth. It makes things a lot easier. So let's just look at a basic example. Now, in QBasic, we always have a for and a next. A for loop, all it does is it simply steps through a range. So, for example, we could say I equals 0 to 3. Print I. So what this statement is going to do is, it's basically, so we're going to do 3 things, the 3 things I just talked about, all in one quick step. So instead of having to initialize I, we've already told it that I is going to start at 0. So we've already initialized it. We don't have to worry about that. We're also going to immediately evaluate it. So I is equal to 0. So as long as I is equal to 0, which it is, we're going to loop through, and then we're going to print I. And this for statement right here is actually also doing the alter. Every time we do a next, I automatically goes up by 1 in this particular version. I'll show you another version where when we do next, we step up by a different number. So let's run this really quickly. And you'll see that this should just print 0 to 3, just like our while loop did, but it's much more simple. So you see that it's definite in that we always know, it's going to loop through 4 times, 0, 1, 2, and 3. In its most basic form, that is a for loop. So it's going to print I every time we do a next. I changes from 0 into 1, into 2, into 3, and each time it loops through, it prints whatever I is during that particular iteration. So that's a really quick, simple way to do for loops. If you are writing a program and you know exactly how many times you need to loop through something, use a for loop. We're going to be using for loops in Chapter 5 in the next chapter a little bit more extensively when we start talking about arrays. And we'll get more into that in Chapter 5, but for loops are really useful when we're evaluating arrays. So it's important to know what this is. Now, I mentioned that in this example, we're stepping by 1. So I goes from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3. Now, we can also step it by 2. Let's change this from 0. Let's change it to 10. We can add in a step 2 in here. So now what this is going to do is I will start at 0, and we're going to step up by 2 every time we do next and loop back through. So instead of showing 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it should show 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So it's stepping up by 2. We could also change this to step up by 3. You can change it to be whatever step value you want. So you see 0, 3, 6, 9, stepping up by 3. We can also step down or do a negative number. So let's say that I is 10 to 0, and we want to step down by negative 2. So we can step down and go from 10 to 0, going down by negative 2. So that is pretty much it for loops. They're very simple. The important thing to note is that it initializes the loop control variable, evaluates the loop control variable, and alters the loop control variable, all in one simple statement. And it's always going to be a definite loop, meaning we know exactly how many times we are going to loop through with a for loop. I think that is it. Okay, one more thing I wanted to show you guys. In your homework this week, I had you do some exercises. If any of you guys were smart and possibly watched these videos before you did the exercises, you would see that you would realize that, hey, in QBasic, I can quickly figure out the answer to all of these homework questions by just simply entering in the code in the QBasic and having it evaluate and show the answer for me. So this is actually problem D, which I did not assign to you guys. I assigned A, B, C, and E. This is D in page 152 of your book. I simply just typed out in QBasic the exact same pseudocode that they have in the book. All it does is it gives you 4 different variables and some numbers, and has you do this one has a nested loop. So this is a nested while loop. So we have a loop inside of another loop. At the end, it's going to print out the values of J, K, M, and N after we do some looping. So when I run this, it's going to show me this output, and that's my answer. You could do this for any of the problems. What I really wanted to just show you here is that this nested loop. We're doing a loop inside of another loop. That happens quite often in programming, where you actually need to loop one inside of another for whatever reason. But it works the exact same way as other while loops. You have to, again, the loop control variable has to be initialized. So in this particular nested loop, M is the control variable. It's initialized here. Actually, it's initialized up here, and then again here, and then it's altered here. And this is where it's evaluated. So that is happening inside of this other loop where j is the control variable, and j has been initialized and then gets altered here. So that's all I have. That's chapter 4 for QBasic. As always, email me if you guys have any questions.